slide?
Yes, we can. I'm just going to do a short profile of you so that people know who's speaking.
Okay.
Okay, so Mr. Ken is the founder of Kent Outsourcing Services, consulting with well over 200 companies and providing their employees with education courses in operations and supply chain management. Ken has been involved with SAPIX for over 30 years, from running the Cape Town chapter to being on the board of directors and holding the position of president twice. Ken is an instructor for the APIC, CPIM, CSCP, CLTD, and instructor development programs. He's also an instructor for the DDI, DDP, and DDL courses, as well as a certified trainer for the Fresh Connection business simulation software. We would like to thank you for joining us, sir, and the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much. I guess after that I can forget the next slide. But the two people I really want to talk about today are these two people, and they've already been mentioned by our previous speaker, Carol Patak and Chad Smith. They are the partners in the Demand Driven Institute. And just a little bit of quick history. Carol Patak, I first met Carol when she was APIX president and I was SAPIX president, and the APIX presidents love to come out to South Africa and have a holiday. And I first met her, she was working at IBM at that stage. And prior to that, she'd been working in the aircraft industry, aircraft components, right on the factory floor, planner, expediter, etc., etc. And so I met her for the first time, as I was saying, about the year 2000. It wasn't until about 2013, I think it was, when I went to an APIX conference in America, and I saw Carol was on the speaking list. So I went and had a listen to what Carol was talking about. In fact, at that point in time, I was almost thinking of retiring because I was having so much trouble getting my clients to implement their ERP systems effectively that I thought, no, this is time to leave now. Anyway, I went into Carol's presentation, and it was the first time she had introduced the APIX community to the demand-driven materials requirements planning concept. And I walked out of that presentation and said, look, there's no way I'm retiring. This is what I've been looking for. This stuff is going to work. And since then, I've really hitched my wagon to Carol and Chad as well. Chad comes out of the theory of constraints, running a company called Constraint Management Group. And together, both Carol and Chad were also talking about, well, it's a bit crazy the way we plan our businesses on an inaccurate forecast. Isn't there a better way of doing that? And between them, they put this methodology together, which I'm going to talk a little bit about today, called demand-driven materials requirements planning. So materials requirements planning, traditional materials requirements planning, really started, I think, way back when Joe Orlicke wrote the book MRP, Materials Requirements Planning, and it was published in about 1975. And it promised features here: time phase planning, level by level bill explosions, dependent amount planning. We got component synchronizations, reductions in inventory, improved priorities. So we were getting quite a few benefits from that. When Joe wrote his book in 75, he said at the time there were about 700 manufacturing companies that were implementing this methodology. And since then, it really became the way of life as far as planning was concerned. But it really goes back to the 1950s when we conceived the idea of being able to take a bill of materials and then explode down through that bill of materials to work out what requirements we needed as far as components and raw materials were concerned. But we didn't have computers to do the thousands of calculations that were needed to be done. If you had one finished product and 6 raw materials, you could do it on a piece of paper. And it wasn't until about 1965 when a chap called Richard Ling, working at IBM, wrote the first algorithms for materials requirements planning. And I've had the pleasure of meeting Dick a couple of times. He's well into his 80s now. But he said he had about 12K of memory when he wrote those algorithms for IBM. Now, though the algorithms he wrote, the code that he wrote is basically the same code you have in your ERP systems today. Nobody has ever changed it. But it wasn't until it was commercialized in about the 1970s that things started to happen. I put my first MRP system in about 1988 in a company here in Cape Town, and it was relatively successful. But since then, something has gone terribly wrong. When I go and talk to planners and buyers, they mistrust their planning tools. They don't believe what they see in there. Spreadsheets and the use of spreadsheets have become rampant. Even Aberdeen Group say that the companies they regard as best in class, over 60% of them are using spreadsheets to augment their planning systems. And these are unmonitored. They have limited capability, reliability, and scalability. And generally, they're very personal. If anybody leaves the company, the spreadsheet generally leaves with them. Also, they're very error prone. There was some work done in 2013 where they found about 90% of spreadsheet documents contained errors in at least 1% of the calculation cells. And yet we blindly follow what these things are telling us. Seems crazy that we spend millions of dollars buying ERP systems and end up running the company on something we can buy down the computer shop for $9.99. Somebody once said that if Microsoft pulled everybody's Excel licenses, business would shut down globally. And they're probably right. Now, if we look at when our traditional planning systems that we use today were developed in 1965, and we look at the world today, we can see we're in a totally different new normal. And I think I can attest to this because I started working in about 1965. I know I don't look that old. And the only technology we had was the landline, telephone, and the post office, and that was it. And yet today, we have so much brilliant technology, and yet we still use the planning tools that were developed over 50 years ago, which sounds a bit crazy, doesn't it? So if you look at the complexity of supply chains, the product life cycles, these have changed dramatically. Customer tolerance times have shortened. Product complexity has increased tremendously, and customization and variety is increased tremendously. We have long lead time parts now. We're buying stuff and selling stuff around the world. Forecast accuracy has become much more difficult. And I've been involved in helping companies with forecasting and demand management for at least 25 years, and it's not getting any easier. There's a huge pressure for leaner inventories. I've never yet been into a company and the boss has said to me, Ken, we have too little inventory. Can you help us get more? It's always been the other way around. And transactional friction now is very low. We can do transactions across the internet at the speed of light, whereas previously it was all done by post, and there was a very high friction as far as those transactions are concerned. So the world has changed dramatically. Today, supply chains look very different from where they were in the 60s when these conventional planning rules were formulated. And they haven't changed at all since the 50s. They're exactly the same in your software today as they were way back. So we have a very new normal in our supply chains. Supply chains have elongated, they're fragmented, while customer tolerance times have dropped dramatically. And this disparity means holding stock at some strategic point is a must to keep or grow your sales. This also means that planning horizons are more remote from the actual demand, longer forecast horizons. Also, there's no products, there are more products with shorter lifespans to manage. Many common components are resources that they use as well. This means managing stock positions effectively is a must for effective capital and resource management. This also means that detailed item level forecasts are very much more difficult. And we all know the 3 rules of forecasting. They're going to be wrong. The longer the range that we're looking at, the more wrong they're going to be, and the more detailed we look at, the more wrong they're going to be. And yet we continuously try to drive our day-to-day business on a number that is inaccurate, and we know it's inaccurate. Even at best, probably a forecast is a 70% accurate at SKU level, but that's probably at best. Many companies are probably a lot worse than this. Let's have a look at some conventional inventory management effects. What I've got here is a single SKU, a single item, and we have 2 universal points of inventory. Down here at A, where I've got nothing, or worse still, I've got orders and I've got back orders here. And then I've got B. this point B over here, where I've really got too much inventory for my current requirements. If we draw a line between these 2 points, this indicates the return on the investment that I've got in that inventory. When I've got no inventory, I'm not getting a return on investment, and it's probably costing me money because I'm expediting, flying stuff in. Over here, I've invested too much money in my inventory, and I'm not getting the return that I would like. So between these 2 points, we have a kind of optimal range here. If we can get all our stock keeping units in this optimal range and keep it in that optimal range where I'm going to get a maximum return from my investment, this would be first prize, would it not? However, when we go into warehouses, and I've done this many times over the last couple of years now, if we look at the number of SKUs in a warehouse, we can see that we have a number of them where we have too little or we're out of stock. And then we have another pile over here where we have really too much. And what I've generally found is that the hump on the right-hand side here is considerably less than the hump on the left-hand side here, because buyers and planners buy double to stay out of trouble. Okay, and we have a very few SKUs sitting in the optimal range here. And if you're in manufacturing, it gets even worse than that, because we're in a nasty situation here. But what happens is that when we run MLP, we flip-flop from being okay to being not okay, and then we flip back to being okay again, and then back to not okay. And most companies that are using materials requirements planning are reporting this kind of issue. So this is not a happy situation to be in. So bottom line effects, we have chronic shortages, we have excessive inventories, we have high expedite expenses where we are flying parts in, or we're cross shipping across depots and distribution centers. This is all waste, or we're breaking into long production runs because we're run out of stock in the supply chain. So this is not a happy situation to be in. But maybe the problem is at a much higher level. Now, I've been involved with Apex and for the last 30 years, and in the Apex dictionary, we've had this thing called the bullwhip effect. And nobody seems to have come up with some way of mitigating this bullwhip effect in the supply chain until now. But what is this bullwhip effect? It is really the transference and amplification of variability in both directions. So we get demand signal distortion going up the supply chain. So we get a small change in the demand at the end item assembler here. And by the time we've gone up through the supply chain to the foundry that's producing the castings for this supply chain, this signal distortion can be enormous. We get the same problem coming down the supply chain. If the foundry has a glitch in delivering the castings, this can ultimately have an enormous effect down here at the end item assembler. So we've had these bullwhips rushing up and down our supply chains for decades, and we've never really had any way of mitigating it or stopping it. And the more parts you've got, of course, the worse the effect is. So the true solution must deal with this demand and supply distortion together. And if you want to see how this bullwhip effect works, just play the MIT beer game, and it explains brilliantly how this effect happens up and down our supply chains. So what have we got here? We've got demand signal distortion, which is resulting in supply continuity variability. So materials are not ready when we actually need them. And why does this happen? Because we're using signals with known error, latent signals are being used, oversimplified signals are being used, and changing and conflicting signals happen. So if we can fix the demand signal distortion, is the bullwhip solved? Well, unfortunately, it's not. And why is that? Because MRP plans are never properly synchronized. I'm going to come back to this diagram later on. So demand-driven MRP was first articulated in this particular third edition of Orlicky's Materials Requirements Planning. The second edition was written by George Plossel in about 1996, I think it was. Carol and Chad have written the third edition, which came out in 2011. And it was in 2012 when she first introduced this concept to the Apex community. Since then, they've written another book on demand-driven MRP. And if you go and buy this book, make sure you get version 3, because it's actually printed in color and they've added some more material into it. So make sure you get the third edition of that. So what is demand-driven MRP? It's a method to model, plan, and manage supply chains to protect and promote the flow. Now, this is a key word here, the flow of relevant information and materials. DDMRP uses strategic decoupling points to drive supply order generation and management throughout the supply chain. Now, Carol says she's standing on the shoulders of giants, and we've had some fantastic people doing great work, and our previous speaker spoke about a few of them. We've got Orlicky with with the materials requirements planning and distribution requirements planning, but there's Ono with just-in-time and lean, and probably more recently Womack and Jones as far as lean is concerned. Then we've got Ellie Goldratt and the theory of constraints. And we've got Edward Deming and Six Sigma taking variation out of the supply chain. So these are just tools, and we're not throwing, as we say in English, the baby out with the bathwater. We want to continually use these tools to improve our supply chains, but taking the best out of these tools and some innovation. The Demand-Driven Institute has come up with the DDMRP, which is about positioning material in the supply chain correctly, protecting that position, and then pulling from that position in real time. And another word we've added on to the end of here, this now, is adapting the supply chain, making sure that we dynamically adjust our supply chains based on what is happening out there in the marketplace. Now, there are 5 components of DDMRP, and we must do them in this order. And don't leave town without doing number 1 first, which is strategic decoupling, making that decision as to where we are going to strategically decouple the supply chain with a stock buffer. Once we've decided that, we can then determine what is the ideal size of that buffer. So we have buffer profiles and we have buffer levels. And I like this diagram here because a buffer, somebody mentioned, I think Samson asked about buffers in his question. The buffer is like a shock absorber in your motor car. It takes out the shock, it takes out that variation in the surface of the road. Well, this buffer also takes the shock out in the variation of the demand for this particular item at this point in the supply chain. It performs a similar job. But we know that our marketplace is changing continuously. And so we need to dynamically adjust these buffers to take account of increased demand or reduced demand or seasonal demand or reducing demand, whatever it might be. We need to dynamically adjust these buffers. So these first 3 components are really setting up our operating model. We're determining where to keep it, how much to keep, and how we dynamically want to increase or decrease those buffers depending on the actual marketplace. So this is our operating model, which is continuously being adjusted, improved as we go through life. Once we've got that going, we can then move into dynamic demand-driven planning, and we can go into visible and collaborative execution. Now, interestingly enough, traditional materials requirements planning does not have an execution ability attached to it. Whereas with DDMRP, we do have this execution availability, which is a real bonus. Let's go back to that diagram we looked at earlier. And we asked the question, why are we using latent signals here? Well, one of the reasons is that often we're doing weekly planning, we're using weekly buckets. So some of the information we're using is already a week old. Why do we have oversimplified signals? Well, in many cases, people have tried to improve the way they do the planning by flattening the bills of materials, taking out intermediate items. We now need to put them back, by the way, if you've done that. Changing and conflicting signals. Why does that happen? Because of nervousness. Now, Dick, who wrote wrote MRP back in '65, knew about nervousness, how nervous the MRP systems were. He developed firm planned orders to try and take out some of this nervousness. He developed master production scheduling to try and put more stability into the system. And later in life, with his partner, Andy Koldrick, they got very involved in sales and operations planning. So we have this nervousness, changes in conflicting signals all the time. When we run MLP, we get these conflicting signals happening. Why do we get this? Because adjustments must occur as actual demand becomes known. We have driven our planning system on a forecast of 100, perhaps, sent that signal up the supply chain. We've got materials coming down to build 100. And then when the customer finally orders, he wants 120. Now I've got a problem. Adjustments are going to have to be made to try and satisfy the customer. Why does this happen? Because MLP is loaded with forecasts. We haven't had any other way of doing it up to now. Why do we have to put forecasts in the system? Because the cumulative manufacturing and procurement lead times are very much longer than the time that the customer is prepared to wait for his product. So MRP treats everything as dependent. So MRP plans are never properly synchronized. Why is that? Because supply variability transference causes delays. And any delay we get in a process, it accumulates. Delays are accumulating all the time, whereas gains do not. And so typically things are always ending up late. Why is that? Because MLP plans, that's the timing and quantity required, are built using all these dependencies. And so we get all these delays happening. So this is the main reason why our current planning systems are really not working for us. So what about strategically decoupling, putting inventory in the right place in the supply chain? Let's go back to that supply chain we were looking at earlier. And let's make a decision to strategically buffer the components between the component manufacturer here and the subassembler. What happens now when that demand signal distortion goes up the supply chain? It hits that buffer and stops dead. Yes, it starts up again on the other side until we get to the next buffer and it will stop dead again. The same thing happens coming down. That supply continuity variability stops dead when it gets to the buffer. And the main reason is that your buffer always has availability. It should always have stock. It should never run out of stock. If it does, you've got the wrong buffer profile, or you need to redesign that buffer in some way. And then it starts up again as we come down the supply chain. So by strategically buffering our supply chain, this stops the transference and amplification of variability in both directions, no matter what. But there's a second benefit, and that is it shortens the plan. So now I can plan this portion of the supply chain totally independently from the portion of the other portion of the supply chain. We don't even have to talk to each other. They're totally independently planned, and we've shortened the lead times. Where do we place inventory in the supply chain? Well, if you come on the 2-day course, we go through this in a great deal of depth, but basically there are 6 decoupling point strategies which we can look at. We look at the customer tolerance time or market potential lead time. If I shorten lead times, how is that going to affect my business? What about sales order visibility? If there's a lot of external variability, that's probably a good place to place inventory. Within our bills of materials, are there subassemblies or mixes that we should perhaps buffer? And this last one comes straight out of theory of constraints, because it says if you have a bottleneck or a constrained capacity, then we need to put a buffer of material in front of it to make sure that it never stops. This is just one little example here of a company that was make to order, an engineering company. They weren't buffering anything initially, and their quotes to their customers were 8 weeks to manufacture their components. By moving into DDMRP system, they started looking at buffering at certain points in their process, and they managed to get their lead time down to their customers by 1 week. Now this is down to 1 week. So this is fantastic. I mean, how's this going to affect your business? If you can, all your competitors are quoting 8 weeks out there, and you can go out and quote 1 week. This is going to increase your business. You may even be able to demand a higher price because you can get it to the customer a lot quicker. So MRP was never designed to decouple. It makes everything dependent, forcing these long plans and variability accumulations. So the second component is about buffer profiles and levels. And as I've said, the buffer is more like a shock absorber, taking those shocks out of the demand or supply at this point in the supply chain. Again, in the 2-day course, we go into a lot of time constructing these buffers and how you calculate them. But just roughly, we have 3 zones. We have a red, yellow, and green zone. And the green zone is typically based on the order frequency. How often do I want to reorder this particular part? And the size of the orders. The yellow zone is basically about the primary coverage in the buffer. And is always calculated as the lead time times the average daily usage. The red zone is the safety in the buffer. This is not safety stock. It does not work in the same way as safety stock. It is the shock absorber in the buffer. So if you've got a lot of variability at this point in the supply chain, you're probably going to have a bigger red zone. Less variability, a smaller red zone. So we first of all need to set up some group settings. So depending on the type of item, it could be purchased item, manufactured item, a distributed item, and based on whether it's a short, medium, or long lead time, or whether there's high, medium, or low variability, we'll set up a buffer profile, which then enables the system to understand how to calculate the buffer correctly. But then we also need to understand the individual part properties. So we allocate every SKU to a buffer profile, but we need to understand the individual part properties. We need to understand the actual lead time for that part. Is there a significant minimum order quantity? If it's a distributed part, where is it? Which location is it attached to? And then we need to understand what its average daily usage might be. Once we have this buffer and profile level, so we have these zones and buffer levels for each part. So we've got a part here, and we can see that it's got an average daily usage of 17, lead times 21 days. There's a significant order, minimum order quantity of 300. It's been allocated a buffer profile of PLH, which is a purchased item with a long lead time and high variability. And when we do the calculations, we end up with, well, we've got a green zone of 300 because we've got a minimum order quantity here of 300 in this particular case. But if we multiply the ADU here by the lead time, 17 times 21, we should end up with 357. Now, I'm not going to go into the calculation for the red zone. It's a little bit more tricky at this particular stage, but we go through all this in the 2-day course. So the critical difference is that MRP was never designed to manage stock positions. It was designed to be the perfect make-to-order calculator. And we've tried to shoehorn it into doing it for other things. So MRP nets everything to 0. DDMRP never nets to 0. Your buffer should never, ever be empty. So safety stock is more like putting a plaster on a problem or putting a fire out with a fire extinguisher. What a DDMRP buffer is more like a firewall. It stops nasty stuff going from either side through the wall. It's a bit like the firewall you might put in your computer system. It stops nasty things coming in and out of your servers, etc. So think of a buffer as a firewall. Safety stock is more of a fire extinguisher. So the third component of DDMRP is about buffer adjustments, okay? Dynamic buffer adjustments. So you can see here that the black line here is your ADU, and this is over a period of time. It started off at about 10 and up to around 50. And you can see how the buffer has automatically adjusted and grown. There was a period here where the demand dropped off a little bit and it dipped down. It then climbed again, and we're in a position now where it's beginning to drop again. This is totally automatic. You do nothing. It does it automatically for you. However, we do have the ability to put in manually adjusted factors as well. And I don't have time to go into those, but as I say, in the 2-day course, we spend quite a bit of time on that. So the critical difference then is most conventional safety stock and reorder point systems are static and not dynamic. We set them and forget them. And they were probably set 2 or 3 years ago. Nobody has ever adjusted them. Then we move into the really elegant part of DDMRP, I think, which is the demand pull, the demand-driven planning. We're moving to a more relevant demand signal. In the past, conventionally, with master production scheduling and MRP, we've used a forecast to try and drive our day-to-day business. Now we're using a sales order, which is typically much more accurate. A sales order is highly accurate. We know, or the actual demand is very accurate. We know exactly what the customer wants, when and how many. A planned order or a forecast is going to be highly inaccurate. But we need to have a more relevant supply order generation equation. And this is one of the unique features of DDMRP, the net flow equation. So it answers a lot of questions that the planner cares about every day. What's coming to me? What have I actually ordered? If it's a purchased item, what's in the purchase order files? If it's a manufactured item, what's in the manufacturing order files? I also need to know what I actually have in the warehouse today as well. I also need to know what demand do I need to fill immediately? What have I got to ship today, or what's going to be used in the factory today? Is there any future demand that's relevant? And we talk about spikes there. So the buffer status net flow equation is simply on hand, what have I got on hand, plus on order, minus qualified sales order demand. Now, if that figure puts your net flow into the yellow zone, we then simply order up to the top of the green zone. And it's as simple as that. If the net flow equation is in the green zone, there is no order replenishment required. If it's in the yellow zone, or we're still in the red zone, we order up to the top of green. It's as simple as that. So daily, your planner would probably get a screen looking something like this. And here I've got one item that's in the red zone, and I've got a recommended order that I need to place. And then I've got 4 items that are in the yellow zone here as far as net flow is concerned. And we've got recommended orders that need to be replaced. This one's in the green zone, doesn't need to be replaced. There's no order required there. So we see relative priority, and we sort them from the worst situation down to the best situation. So now the planner or the buyer has his or her to-do list for the day. It's kind of a no-brainer. In fact, it's getting to the point where many of our implementations now, people are saying, look, I'm fed up of going and recommending authorizing these orders every day. Just automate it. We know it works. I want to spend my time doing more important things in the business. What about MRP itself? Well, we still use, the reason that we call it demand-driven MRP is that we still use MRP. But we use it in a slightly different way here. We have a decoupled explosion. So here I've got a bill of materials, and the yellow parts here are buffered, all right? So what happens is that when the demand for this buffered 101 item is required, we need to make some more, the MRP explodes down to the next buffer and stops and waits until these buffer net flow are in the yellow zone and require replenishment, and then it starts up again. And it'll go down here to a purchased item, and the buyer would get a planned order, which he'll need to issue to the supplier, but it'll come down to this buffer and then wait until the net flow in this buffer is in the yellow zone, and then the buyer would get a message. So the explosion starts when parts net flow position enters the rebuild zone, and the explosion stops at each stock position, no matter what. Now, your current MRP system can't do that. This is the current traditional MRP system. We started running and it goes right from top to bottom, okay? DDMRP is this decoupled explosion. So you need special software to be able to run this. However, the algorithm we use in between here to do the calculations is exactly the same as what Dick wrote back in 1965. We're not changing that at all. What about execution? Execution looks at the on-hand balance in the buffer. Remember, planning is looking at net flow. Execution is looking at the on-hand balance. And as soon as the on-hand balance starts moving at least down into the second half of the red zone here, we'll start getting expedite warnings. So we can see some of the buffers in priority order that are in a situation. Something's happened, the material hasn't arrived, and we need to go and expedite and find out why. And so there's a critical difference here between MRP, where our priority is based on the due date, and DDMRP, where priority is based on buffer status. Okay, so ask you the question, would you rather have a supplier deliver on the due date, which could be wrong, or never stock you out? And of course, the right answer is never stock you out. So rather than have a list of orders here with due dates on here, which are probably not right, or they've changed ever since the order was released, we now can look at priority. We can see what needs to be done first as far as buffer status is concerned. And that, I think, is a very important issue. So we're moving away from this bimodal distribution into a more normal distribution. So DDMRP has proven that we're now getting a lot more items sitting in this optimal range here. And rather than spending our time on deciding what to order and how many and when, we're focusing on these items out on the tails here and saying, hey, why are these items out here? What do I need to do to get them closer to my optimal range here? So let's spend our time doing things that are much more important than trying to determine what to buy, how many, and when to place the orders. The system can do that for you. Okay, but this is only part of a bigger demand-driven adaptive enterprise model. We've just been talking about this little bit down here. This is the buffers, okay? If we're putting in a proper demand-driven operating model and you've got a complex manufacturing environment, you may want to put in time and capacity buffers as well. But this is the operational side of the business. This is the tactical side of the business, okay? And we have a strategic side of the business here. So we haven't really got time to go into this in a lot of depth, but basically we have strategy over here. Oops, let me go back there. We got strategy here, which is sending business plans and parameters down to your tactical demand-driven S&OP process, which is sending down master settings and model configurations down to your operating model. We're continually looking at that operating model and seeing how we can improve it, continuous improvement. And we're feeding back model projections and innovations and other things back to strategy here. Strategy is being driven by market-driven innovation, but our operations is being driven by actual demand. So this is the bigger picture that we would want to see in your business over a period of time. So what are the proven benefits? Well, to my mind, it's about customer service. People that have implemented this are reporting customer service levels well above 97, in some cases 100%. Service levels we've never ever really seen before. And with right-sized inventory. And generally we find that people typically have too much stuff. And most implementations result in a reduction of 30 to 40% in inventory levels. And at the same time, increasing your service levels up to close to 100%. But in many manufacturing operations, as that little example showed, we can reduce lead times as well. And in some cases, we've got case studies where they've been reduced like 80%. But another important fact is that we're not wasting money now flying stuff in, cross-shipping across warehouses, breaking into schedules. And so we're reducing all those expedite activities due to false signals, etc. We're reducing the cost in our supply chain. But I think most of all, it's very easy and intuitive. Planners pick this up very quickly. I've been involved in an implementation with Coca-Cola in 9 African countries so far. And we were implementing 1 country per month. Couple of days education, couple of days training, the guys are up and running. And I mean, it's very easy to operate this using cloud-based software that's integrated into your ERP system. So lots of case studies. I would encourage you to go to the Demand Driven Institute website, which is Demand Driven Institute, all one word.com. You must sign up, because if you sign up with your name, email, and you can put in a password, you can get access into the on-demand tab down here. In here, you will find the presentations and case studies from the last few Demand Driven World conferences. And so you can go and have a look at those. There's also a lot more resources over here. There's a lot more case studies over here you can look at. But the other thing I would suggest you do is you go into the webinars here, and there are 6 webinars that Carol and Chad have put together. They put them together early on in this year when the virus problem hit us. Little 1-hour webinars looking at all different aspects of demand-driven MRP. Go through those and have a look at them, and encourage you to do that. And if you need more information, you can contact me at Demand Driven Africa. There's our website, demanddrivenafrica.co.za. There's my phone number, there's my email address, and in this website you'll find the education, and we're also very involved in the software that we use to implement these implementations as well. So that's my story. I guess we haven't got much time left, have we? For questions.
No, we do have questions. Of course, you are right on time for the presentation. Thank you so much. You were smart on time, actually. So I'm just going to take, I have 4 questions here, and I think that will be it. How do you effectively manage a demand planning process that delivers excellent customer satisfaction for a highly make-to-order process with 12,000 SKUs?
Yeah. How do I do that? It's make to order process. Okay, fine. For 12,000, you're making 12,000 stock keeping units make to order. That's a lot. Whether you're 100 or 12,000, there should be no reason why you cannot use the same methodology. Just go and have a look at some of the case studies that are out there. Many of them are based on make to order processes. Many of them are make to stock, of course, but there are many make to stock processes out there. My suggestion would be, come on a 2-day demand driven planner course, go back and apply what we teach you to a few of your items, and pick the nasty ones, the real nasty ones, and see how you can use this methodology to your benefit within your supply chain.
Thank you very much. Second question is, in the new normal, in new normal table, the panelists shared that forecast accuracy is high in 1965 and low in 2020. Is this due to COVID-19 or some other reasons account for this?
No, I think if you go back to 1965, if you took a company like Colgate and Crest, they each had 1 toothpaste each, 1 toothpaste. So if you went to your pharmacy to buy toothpaste, you've got Colgate, you've got Crest. Now, if you go into the pharmacy to buy toothpaste, I think Crest has got something like 43 different types of toothpaste. And that's just one manufacturer. And now, instead of trying to forecast 1 toothpaste, I'm now trying to forecast 43 toothpastes, which make it a lot more difficult, isn't it? And we've got more competitors out there. We've got a lot more products being manufactured by a lot more of our competitors. It is just becoming far too difficult to forecast. That doesn't mean to say don't forecast. You must have a reasonable idea of where the future is. Because if you go back to my diagram back here, if I can get back, well, I'm not going back. If I go back to this diagram here, what we do is, this is where our forecasts come in. We don't use our forecasts to try and work out what we do on a daily basis, but we do need to have a forecast and demand management coming in here to look at those model projections into the future and say, where is this business going? So you still need a very good, or the best forecasting and demand management process that you can have, even in a demand-driven MRP process, but don't use it for your day-to-day activities.
Awesome. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for the presentation. What is the relationship between forecasting and demand planning?
Forecasting is the first part of demand planning. What we're talking about here is not demand planning. We're talking about demand driving your processes. Demand planning, or what I call consensus demand management, is a very important part, as I mentioned just now. We still need to have that. We still need to have an idea of where this business is going in the future. Otherwise, we're just flying blind. We don't know. Can't have a strategy into the future. So forecasting, to me, is the first part of demand management. And demand management is broken into three. There's the known, which is customer orders. I know exactly what the customer needs and how many and when. Then I've got what I call the unknown, and this is my current customers and current current customers and current products. And here I would use statistical forecasting methodologies for that. But then I have the third part of demand management, which is the really unknown. That's all my new products, new customers, how things like COVID, Forex rates, oil prices, etc., affect my business, and I need to factor that into my demand planning process.
Okay, thank you. DDMRP and MRP share similarities with just-in-time technique, JIT. What are the differences between JIT and DDMRP and MRP?
Okay, well, as I've said, we use the materials requirements planning in DDMRP to do that decoupled explosion. So we're still using the methodology. We're still using the same algorithm. We're just using it in a slightly different way. Just-in-time and lean, exceptionally important in DDMRP, because again, that comes back to my diagram again here, if I can get back to it. This is where you'll notice that this tactical portion in the middle here is got two colored. It's gold on the left-hand side and blue on the right-hand side. The left-hand side here is where we're continuously looking at our operating model and using things like Lean and Six Sigma and theory of constraints, using those tools to improve our operating model. Okay, so this is where your planners and people are sitting in here. They're not spending lots of time determining what to buy and what to make. They're saying, how can I make the model better using these tools that I've got? Lean, just-in-time, Six Sigma, theory of constraints. So understand how to use these tools, when to use them, and how to use them. We're not throwing them out, definitely using them in DDMRP to improve our operating model.
Okay, is there a difference between buffer stock and safety stock?
Yes.
Okay.
Safety stock in a system is there not to be used. As soon as you hit safety stock, you immediately get a signal to replenish it. And it's a bit like throwing a hand grenade up to your supplier. Hey, I need some more stock, and I need it immediately because I must maintain my safety stock levels. The buffer is different, as I said. The red zone in your buffer is the safety. And you should be using that safety on a regular basis. If you're not, then you're in the wrong buffer profile. So the safety is there to be used. It is that shock absorber to take that little bit of extra demand out that comes your way, and you've got a little bit extra to take account of that. So the fact that we go into the red zone with our on-hand balance doesn't mean to say we suddenly send another order back up to our supplier because I need to replenish it. I've already got orders in the system. Okay, and if ideally what should be happening is that your on-hand balance should fluctuate in the lower half of the yellow zone. Yes, it will pop in to the red zone occasionally, and it becomes a bit of a problem if it pops down to the second half of the red zone. Then we start getting an expedite warning and going and having a look at what the problem might be and seeing if I can resolve it. But
Okay, so
the two are very different in the way they operate.
okay, the last question is, in the new normal, demand projections on so imported, I'm not sure, I think that was a typo, on imported items, I believe, cannot be accurate due to freight lead time.
Yeah.
How can this be addressed?
Yeah, look, I've got some clients that import most of their products from overseas, and of course, yes, we get that variability in lead times, and whether we've got good suppliers or bad suppliers. How do we handle that? We say that it's high variability item. We'll put that SKU into a high variability buffer profile, which means that it'll probably have a larger red zone to take into account that variation in the lead time for these long lead time items. But we found that DDMRP works pretty well for long lead time items. This is where a lot of people are getting a lot of benefit out of the DDMRP processes by applying it to their very long lead time items. And in fact, the first implementation we did in South Africa was a company that was importing a lot of small electronic components from the Far East. And they were always out of stock of something. And if you've only got one component missing, you can't build the product. In the end, they applied DDMRP, first of all, to their purchased items, and they ended up with always having stock and ultimately having overall less stock. So they reduced their inventory, had 100% customer service of their components, and so they could build any product that the customer wanted at any time. And those were very long lead time items that they were getting from the Far East as well. So it does work, and there's a lot of case studies that revolve around that. Yeah.
All right, so I think that will be it. Thank you so much.
Okay.